And I'm not just saying this because I'm at a Jesuit school.
That's good to know, because you forgot one important thing. These reforms making it possible for women for the first time to own property and pass it on. So we never forget women's rights here at the university. I wanted you to know that. So you have this powerful force. Now, of course, there was different times, just like with different Chinese emperors. We just had a wonderful TV special here in the United States, thanks to BBC, about the Borgias. Alexander VI, played by Jeremy Irons, and his daughter, Lucretia Borgia, and his dreadful son, Cesare Borgia. So even into the Renaissance, there was still this quasi-question, but we've cleaned that up now. So there are no more Borgias here or in Rome. So you get us all the way up almost to modern times, where I know you're dying to go. There is a wonderful beginning in the book where you use something you borrowed. It's called On the Way to Denmark, How to Get to Denmark. And of course, you were in Denmark, as I was this fall, and you see this very prosperous people, a huge and wonderful working social democracy, many things that are thought of as very positive. Once upon a time, Denmark was the land of people who simply rampaged and ransacked much of Europe. The Vikings. Sounds like Vikings. They are now Danes. So everyone wants to become, in that sense, as a metaphor, to get to Denmark. Talk to us about that. That transition takes a long time, can be shortcutted. What?
Well, there are many components to that. The book in general argues that you have to have three basic sets of institutions. You have to have a state, which is really about using and concentrating power and enforcing laws. But then you have to have two different other institutions of constraint, which is the rule of law, which we've already discussed, and then institutions of accountability, so that the ruler does what the people want, or acts in some sense in the common interest rather than in the interest just of the ruling group. So you can go to any country, not any country, but there are many, many developing countries today where you look at the president, the prime minister. I was just in Nigeria a couple of weeks ago, which is probably one of the most corrupt countries in the world at the moment, and essentially every politician is simply trying to figure out how to use their political position to loot the state of as much resources as possible. That's the way you get rich, not by creating Apple computers, but basically by becoming a politician and then looting the state. And so the real question is, how did anyone get out of this situation? Because many countries, including Denmark under the Vikings, were this kind of predatory power where you basically use the state to take money from other people. I think that the third leg of accountability is today something we call democracy. We have multi-party elections, which is the mechanism by which we punish people. So in theory, if we get a predatory ruler that is only in it for himself or herself, you go to the ballot box and get them out of there and replace them by someone else. But the question is, where did this mechanism come from in a world where everybody was basically predatory? And here, I think the story is really, in a way, accidental. The rise of democracy was not some inevitable foreordained conclusion, but actually the result of the survival of a very peculiar feudal institution into modern times in a way that proved actually very useful in terms of accountability. So at the end of the Middle Ages, every European feudal society had a set of institutions called estates. In Spain, they were known as cortes. In France, the sovereign courts or parlements. In England, the parliament. In Poland and Hungary, diet. In Russia, Zemsky Sobor. All right? Every one of these institutions was the inheritor of certain feudal rights, primarily having to do with taxation. So if the king wanted to launch a war, he'd have to go to the estate and get money, get permission to tax his subjects. And since these were the people that had the money, they were the ones that he had to listen to. And in the late 16th, 17th century, many European monarchs, including the ones in Denmark and everywhere else in the European continent, decided that they wanted to basically be a Chinese emperor. They didn't know that much about China, but the idea was they wanted to get rid of these estates. They wanted to be able to tax directly. They wanted to be able to launch wars on their own nickel if they had to, without getting this pesky permission from these feudal assemblies. And so in every country there's this prolonged struggle. The French and the Spanish monarchs managed to neutralize or dismantle these estates. And there's only one country in which this process doesn't work, and that is England. Because for various contingent, accidental reasons, the English Parliament, compared to the estates in all of these other European countries, has a high degree of solidarity. For one thing, a lot of them are Protestants, and they suspect the king of having pro-Catholic sensibilities, but there's a lot of other things. The king dares to tread on the common law by creating this court called the Star Chamber, which many Englishmen thought was a terrible violation of ancient legal rights that Englishmen had held. They fight a civil war. They beat the king. They cut off the head of one. This is Charles I, the second Stuart monarch. They then force a second king to abdicate in favor of a pretender, William of Orange, that they bring over from the Netherlands, put him on the English throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, but only on the condition that he rule under a constitutional agreement that basically says no taxation without representation, that Parliament is ultimately sovereign in this area, and furthermore, embodying a principle by the philosopher John Locke that said essentially that the legitimacy of any regime is based on consent of the governed. And in fact, I was just in Leiden over the summer. John Locke lived in Leiden. He came with William of Orange on actually the same ship that this new monarch took. He wrote the Second Treatise of Government in connection with this English struggle. And, if you think about the founding of the United States, less than 100 years later, the Declaration of Independence penned by Thomas Jefferson, a very Lockean document. And what are the principles under which our republic is founded? No taxation without representation, and legitimacy lies in the consent of the governed. The only way that we get there, though, is the fact that this English feudal institution, the Parliament, actually managed to fight a civil war and beat the king and force him into this. In every other country where this didn't happen, you basically get some form of absolutist monarchy. And so I think we're, in a sense, the heirs of this lucky historical break that allowed this to happen. And then England becomes extremely powerful under this constitutional arrangement. It begins, it seeds North America. The United States is created. It becomes a very widespread and popular form of government, but it may not have happened. You could imagine the history of the 17th century playing out very differently, such that all you had were Chinese-style absolute monarchies across Europe, and then we would be in a very different situation, I think, today.
And we almost got two. One was called Louis XIV, the Sun King at Versailles, and the other was called Napoleon Bonaparte. But we want to keep moving. Your mentor at Harvard looked across the horizon and saw a phenomena occurring in the period at the end of the 20th century, and he saw a sweep that he thought was taking hold, in which a fairly sizable number of countries, many in Eastern Europe now free, were becoming part of this race towards freedom, if you want to call it that. And so he wrote a rather famous book about that, A Third Wave. This was a wave of freedom now, not with Parliament in London or the Estates General in Paris, but in fact, new countries joining. And then Sam had to stop for a moment because some took the first baby steps and then stopped, particularly in Central Asia. So the Russian state, which had been the Soviet state, had let go of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. Looks like they were launched, and then they weren't. So we stop, and we look, and we see that maybe it isn't going to sweep the whole globe. but it's going to take root in places that already had the root stock somewhere hidden within the soil or whatever you want to call it. And so that today we just saw announced the second wonderful thing that happened to Poland was that they were able to re-elect a government for the second time, that it seemed quite free, et cetera, and you see this occurring across the Eastern European lands, but not in all lands. So democracy has not swept everywhere, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, first of all, you have to step back a little bit and think about how impressive the third wave was. So in 1970, of all the countries in the world, and at that point there were maybe 120 or so in the General Assembly, maybe a little bit more than that, only 35 to 40 could qualify as electoral democracies, right? Because this is a period when much of Latin America was under military dictatorship. Obviously, communism was very strong. And by the year 2000, that number had gone up to, the number of electoral democracies had gone up to about 120 from 35. And so it really was a very big change in the world. But I think that what you really need to pay attention to beyond just those numbers is the underlying dynamic that's going on, the wave under the third wave. And this is where I think a variety of Huntington's, and by the way, this is also one of the areas where I think he was really wrong because he believed that there would be a big Middle Eastern exception to all of this, because he wrote this other book called The Clash of Civilizations, in which he argued that despite this global wave towards democracy, there would be cultural constraints that would prevent some parts of the world from reaching that point, and that you could have modernized societies in Iran or Saudi Arabia or Egypt that were technologically up to date but still ruled by Islamic fundamentalist regimes. So we've been running this score. Unfortunately, Sam passed away about 3 years ago, but somebody's keeping score here. And so at the time of the Balkan Wars, it looked like, he was up and I was down, because I've argued really that there is this broader wave towards democracy that has underlied, and that this is not culturally dependent. And I think, especially after September 11th, a lot of people would argue that, in fact, Islam is a really big problem, and that a lot of countries in the Middle East are really going to have a hard time democratizing. But I think, actually, that I'm up now after the Arab Spring because, in a sense, it demonstrates that there is a kind of universality to the desire to live in a free society that respects your basic dignity as a citizen. If you think about what triggered the Arab Spring, there's this fellow, Mohammed Bouazizi, who had a vegetable cart in Tunis. He had that cart confiscated by the police on several occasions. He went to complain. Nobody listened to him. Finally, a policewoman slapped him and insulted his family. And that's the point where he got a can of gasoline, poured it on himself, and set himself on fire. And that was really the trigger. And this set off a sympathetic wave throughout the entire Middle East. And it had nothing to do with Islam or Arab culture or anything else. That turns out the Arabs, just like Latin Americans or people in Africa or people in Eastern Europe, don't like to live in stagnant authoritarian regimes that do not respect their basic human dignity. And that's really not dependent on culture. And in fact, I think the modernization hypothesis that I believe in was also demonstrated, because the people that lead this kind of a movement in general tend not to be the poorest, the most marginalized, most disadvantaged people in an unequal society. They tend to be the middle class. They tend to be people with more education, that are connected to the world, that can use Facebook and Twitter and have access